What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode and welcome to 2024. This is the first week back in the office and I'm pleased to have our first guest conversation of the year. Now, my guest this week is from Manchester and he has had a really interesting career, which we're going to go into a bit today. But just to give you a couple of ideas, he spent 5 years living in Japan. And he also came back to the UK and he spent a year in the role of Lord Mayor of Norwich, no less. Then he turned his attention to property, and we'll go into the motivation behind that. But one of the things that you listeners might find interesting is, like everyone these days, he struggled to pull the money together for his first deal. And just getting started, getting that first deal over the line is the real struggle that a lot of people have. And so we're going to go into some of that and how it motivated him to create his own podcast and his own networking group that meets every other week. It's called a Cup of Coffee Podcast. And I'm going to put in the show notes below, I'll put a link to that. But I'll let our guest tell his own story. And so without further ado, my conversation with Tom Dillon. Tom Dillon, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me, Gavin. Really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to being here. If that's wrong straight off the bat.
Don't worry. Tell us, Tom. So you're in Manchester, and you're a property investor. For people who have not heard of Tom Dillon, and we have a pretty international audience, why don't you just give us a quick, elevator pitch style? What does Tom Dillon do?
Everything badly. What do I do? I have a single let portfolio, and along with my business partner Chris Jenkins, we have a joint portfolio which is mostly multiple unit blocks, so flats and an HMO and bits and pieces. And then we have a mentoring business. And on top of that, perhaps most people know me, if they do know me at all, from the Cup of Coffee property podcast, which like yours has been running for a few years and as I'm pleased to say has been quite successful.
Nice intro, nice and quick. And tell us, Tom, you and I had a bit of a brief chat offline before we hit record. What is it that brought you into property? Because there's a few things that we're going to talk about and you know what they are. I've already kind of highlighted. But in terms of your interest in property, like what was that kind of catalyst that got you thinking, I must get into property?
Sure. Funnily enough, for those who missed it, which is everybody, our pre-chat was great. It's one of the finest pre-chats anyone's ever had. So sorry you missed it, but anyway, I'm sure you've had your own pre-chats. Anyway, what got me into property? I've always been a save the whale merchant, although I'm not that interested in whales, but it gives people an idea of what I'm talking about. A green machine. I was reading the other day that by 2050, or pick a year, somewhere around there, all the beaches you've ever been to will be underwater, and that hit me. Like, wow, okay, I don't even like beaches, but I don't want them all to disappear. Jakarta slipping into the sea, etc., etc. We all know it's bad news, right? The other thing that struck me about the bad news was, and this is relevant, it's kind of answering your question, was that the bad news doesn't sort of stop. It's like, I pictured like, I don't have any children, but if I did, and their children and their children, it's like, they're still going to be facing it. In 10 generations, maybe you don't care about your children in 10 generations, but even in 3 generations of the grandkids, they're still going to be facing it, and worse. It's like, oh, Christ. I kind of hoped, in my mind, I kind of went, oh, climate change, but then we'll be okay. Like, no, it just keeps on going. The ice sheets keep melting, it turns out. Anyway, so that's the starting point. I remember sitting in a traffic jam aged about 6, just on some motorway somewhere, looking around at all the car exhausts. And back in 1986, the car exhausts were real car exhausts, probably smoke and billowing clouds and all that. And it was colder then, of course, so you could really see it. And I thought, wow, if this is just one small stretch of road in one tiny piece of Manchester or wherever we were, and this is all over the world, like, we're screwed. I don't know much about the Earth at 6 years old, but I know it can't take this for very long. It turns out I was right, and but I take no joy in that. And then so that kind of influenced my journey to becoming a Green Party person in my 20s and try and save the whale. After about 5 years working for the Green Party in Norwich, because that's one of the places we were strong at the time and still are, Norwich Green Party massive. We did very well, but after 5 years there, my boss and one of my heroes, a guy called Adrian Ramsey, who's I think currently the leader of the Green Party, he was at that time moving away to become a CEO of something else. People thought that I would go on to take his job, but I looked at it and realized that it was a very, very hard job, and I'd seen that because I was his sort of second in command, right-hand man, call it what you will, office organizer. And so I'd seen that it was a really tough job, and that the pay wasn't great, and that while I've never been that motivated by money, it did seem that if we were going to save some whales, that was not going to be free. And so it struck me there was a kind of a turning point, a decision point to be made there. And so I got a big sheet of A4 paper. If I'd have had a post-it note, that would have been fine. I didn't need such a big piece of paper because on it I wrote everything I could think of ways to like make money. That whole thing about Warren Buffett saying if you you either need to work out how to make money while you sleep or you'll work until you die. And so I tried to work out ways that I could make money. I didn't know that quote at the time, but I knew that I wanted to try and make money passively. I probably didn't know that word either. And so what I wrote down was stocks and shares, and then I wrote down property, and then I ran out. I sat there for like 20 minutes with this large bit of paper and only two things written on it. I thought, well, that's all I got. So I could probably do a little bit better now, but that's what I had then. And then I thought stocks and shares feels a bit, and it does to me now too, having never done it from a position of ignorance. It feels like you'd stare at the screen, praying that the blip goes upwards. Otherwise, you've lost it all on, on Brent crude or whatever it is. Probably not Brent crude in my case, but you know what I mean. And maybe you've got some analysis behind it, and maybe you haven't. But knowing me, I probably wouldn't have. So I thought, right, well, that seems like not a great way to spend 15 hours a day. So let's do property instead. And the sort of background to that was that my dad had done it for many years in a very small time, amateur kind of way, but successfully. Never lost money on anything. So I had that background. Maybe you do what you see. The apple never falls far from the tree. So there's a bit of that going on, and so that's when I decided to get into property.
Interesting. Okay, so a bit of an influence from your dad, but it's funny because the motivation getting into property, like property is, as far as it's also important for me, sustainability and all that kind of stuff. But you've got 40% of all greenhouse gases are created by the property world, we'll say the built environment.
Sure.
So it's definitely something that we can all do better on, but it's not always easy to achieve that. And I was mentioning to you before we were hit record that the office portfolio that I look after, like nowadays, we're having to try to make these buildings much more sustainable and green and stuff. And sometimes the economics just, they do not stack. It's very, very hard to make it work. I mean, of course, we want to do it, but the bank have to agree a lot of the time to these kind of financing requests to upgrade the building. And if you're not able to articulate why this is a good deal, because it's going to create this extra return or whatever, a lot of the time there's not an extra return. It's just simply you're doing it to stay relevant.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. It's funny, isn't it? These are the same banks. And by the way, I'm not anti-bank. I've got a couple of remortgages going through at the minute. So good old banks.
We're all good guys.
Yeah. Oh, I love the banks. But that said, is like these are the same banks who, when the water starts coming down the street, are going to be the ones pulling out the mortgage, saying, "Oh, we're not lending anymore." But that's almost, and I genuinely don't blame the banks. I blame the fact that corporations of any size and stripe and whatever else have to make a profit. They're acting illegally if they fail to try and maximize their profits. If instead it said, "Hey, let's try and maximize the good we can do in the world," that's your legal obligation. Then I think the banks would act differently and be all over your solar panel measures or wind turbines or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And air source heat pumps is a big one. I had a property recently, just a simple single let house, and I thought, right, let's do the right thing, right? Let's get a good EPC rating. Until recently, the UK government was talking about having a minimum EPC rating. In fact, it does have a minimum EPC rating, but it's talking about increasing that. And as a lot of people will be aware. And I thought, right, air source heat pump. I called the company, and they had almost it was a lady, but it was almost a recorded message because she just sort of said, you read off the script. You answered the phone and said, "Hello, airsourceheatpumps.com. Just so you know, the minimum price for a air source heat pump installed is £12,500. Would you still like to continue the call?" And I went, "No, I think I'm all right," and I imagine a lot of other people do as well, and it sort of saves them. I think they should replace that person with a robot.
That's called qualifying your leads. Yeah.
Right. And and again, I'm not blaming that company or blaming anyone. Maybe the government need to do more to subsidize that, as they did maybe 10 years ago quite well for a short time with solar panels. Lots of people, including my parents, got PV panels on their house and sort of now getting the payback on that. And of course, the environment gets the payback on that every day. But so to go back to your question, is like the built environment is 40% of the energy output. And, yes, it is. My humble view is that we need to take it from all sides, don't we? So the fact that when my dad was born, I think there was 2 billion people in the world, and by the time he dies next week, whenever, hopefully long into the future, looks like human population, maybe after my dad's gone, is going to peak at like 11 billion. 2 to 11 in 100 years or thereabouts is just crazy. It does look like then it's going to really fall off a cliff, but it's like in Japan or Italy or these countries where you've got a population that's either stalling or falling. and people are saying, "Oh, this is the biggest problem since forever." And I was like, "Meh, it feels to me like the biggest opportunity." And maybe the countries which are in a fortunate position to help for us to reduce our emissions to something reasonable. But anyway, this is a property podcast, so I should have about saving the world.
You talked about, you mentioned Japan there, and as I was looking through your past life and things that you've done, you said you spent a couple of years in Japan, and Japan is an interesting country. It's one that I've always been kind of fascinated by and interested to kind of visit, although I haven't visited it yet. I know
Sure.
Tokyo is one of the biggest cities in the world and stuff. Like, whereabouts in Japan did you go, and tell us about it?
Sure. Japan was great. Probably pretty much everybody listening either has been to Japan and loved it, or it's the top of their list of places to go, or very close to it. I've met very few people who are like, Japan sucks, or I've got no interest in it. But I think because it's so different, people are interested in it, and that was certainly the case for me. The truth of it, and just sticking to the truth, which is always a good place to start, was that after university, me and a pal had no idea what we wanted to do. Traveling was the thing. We thought, let's do that as a way of booting any life decisions down the track. So we did that, and as a massive green hypocrite, I then flew around the world for a year. But the starting point, the hook, was that the university we were at did an exchange program, so we got 4 weeks more or less paid for,
Oh,
and then we
nice.
did 3 weeks of our own around Japan, and then we did nothing but complain about it while we were there because it's so different and so difficult. You know, some days were 37 degrees. We didn't have any aircon, or if we did, you know, it was a fortune to pay for. And so there's all these interesting challenges. You'd arrive at a train station and there's just a big bank of kanji on the wall, you know, looking back at you, the Chinese characters, and you're thinking, I don't know, not only do I not know where I'm going, I don't know where I am on this map, and I don't know what the coins are because that's not written on in English, etc., etc. It's really challenging. I remember
Yeah.
getting a McDonald's because it was like safe and I'm vegetarian, so there wasn't much for me at McDonald's. I thought, listen, you know, I can probably get some fries in there, so I did to stay alive, you know. So I got some fries on my first day there, and the guy handed me the tray, and I realized I didn't know the word for thank you, so I just kind of weakly said thank you, and felt like an absolute, you know, idiot, frankly. Sort of determined at that point I'd try and learn some of the language, and then we travelled for a year, me and my pal, and then we went back. Both of us, by the time we hit by the time we touched down in Korea, which was our next stop, we both said, yeah, we're going back there to live because that was a fascinating country, despite all our complaints, and that's exactly what we did. So he's now married with to a Japanese wife with 2 children, lives in London, and I'm up here, and my wife's Japanese. So yeah, it's a great country.
Interesting. And one of the things, I mean, did you spend time in Tokyo when you were there?
Yeah, yeah. We never lived there, but yeah, I spent training trips and all
Yeah.
this kind of stuff out there. I was essentially teaching out there, but lots of the training stuff was in Tokyo, and it's a great place to hang out. So I've been back since. I probably spent total nearly 4 years in Japan because I've been back quite a few times. Again with a bit of green hypocrisy firmly in the back pocket. So yeah, a lot of time in Tokyo. Lived in Osaka, and then lived in a tiny place called Kagawa, which my friends nicknamed Dinosaur Island, because it looked a bit like Jurassic Park.
Right. Well, the reason I'm asking about Tokyo is my one of my cousins went and spent some time in Tokyo, and
Sure.
you remember he explained what it's like to get the train to
Mm,
work in the morning, and as a commuter, and he said he was standing on this on the platform for the train, and he says it was the most, packed platform he's ever experienced, like literally up against people's faces. And he said then the train door opened and he saw just a completely packed train. And so he hesitated for a second. And then when the people behind him realized he was hesitating, they all piled in like, and he was just like, "What? You mean there was space there?" And and he said that he let three or four trains pass in that exact way, and then realized this is normal. This is what you just have to like get used to.
yeah.
Was that kind of your experience, or was it not so bad?
Yeah, well, Tokyo's absolutely like that at Russia. What's nice is that everyone's totally really polite and nice with it, despite the fact you are genuinely sardining the hell out of it. And God forbid if any of the trains ever have an accident, but they don't seem to, so that's good. Especially if they're running every 90 seconds or whatever it is, you know. But it's a busy place. I was reading the other day. There's 38 million people in Tokyo. My favorite, which your cousin may or may not have seen, is the Oshiya, which are the guys and girls who wear the big white gloves and they
And they
work on the
push you.
station platforms, pushing them in. What a job! I'm thinking, you know, like semi-retirement. If this property thing doesn't work out, that's where you'll find me because I'm
Yeah.
quite big, quite broad-shouldered. I think pushing Japanese people into a train every 90 seconds. Oh, in a nice, polite way. Good morning, good morning. Here you go into the train. Hey, shut the doors. Sounds like a great way to spend your mornings to me.
And the next thing I was going to talk about in terms of your varied career, Lord Mayor of Norwich City Council.
Mm,
Now, tell us about that because that is obviously at the age of 29,
mm.
it doesn't seem like what the average 29-year-old would be doing. So, first of all, tell us what your motivation was, and then like just what your experience of being the Lord Mayor was.
Well, I'll probably do that in reverse. Being the Lord Mayor was great. As far as anyone knows, I was either the or one of the youngest Lord Mayors in the country. Um, but nobody can really be asked checking because the Lord Mayor role goes back to like the 1100s. And of course, if you made it to 29 years old in 1100, you're doing quite well. People just
Yeah,
finish school and then wait
or
for the
middle
feet to
age.
set
Yeah,
in. So I might have been one of the oldest ones back there. But in recent times, I was certainly one of the youngest ones. The reason the year was great because it gave you. This is something that somebody told me at the start, and it was absolutely right. Is it gives you a chance to peek into all the dark corners of a city that nothing else gives you the chance to do. Because if the Lord Mayor turns up, especially in the Gab, to whatever it is, whether it's a lovely big garden party at some wealthy person's house, which there's some of those kind of events, but also like we go to support there was an event run by, I forget who was run by, if I'm honest, but it was a brilliant event to support street sex workers and ex-street sex workers. And by turning up as the Lord Mayor, first of all, you get a chance to meet these people and see what's going on and understand, as I say, the darker corners of the city, but also to show from a sort of, because when you're wearing the robes and wearing the stuff, it's not that they don't care. I'm Tom Dillon. They don't care about me, Tom Dillon. Hi, I'm Tom Dillon. They don't care about that. What you are at that point. In the same way, the Queen, or in a much smaller way, of course, I'm not comparing myself, but is a representative of the city, and it shows that the city cares. It shows that someone in an authority cares about your plight or about your situation. But that goes for a thoroughly pleasant garden. I remember going to an event with people doing gardening in a community garden. Whatever it is, it shows support for those people and for what they're doing, even if you can't turn up with a big check because you don't have that many big checks. But then some funny ones. A couple of funny stories were 6 in the morning. I was there opening a Matalan, and the rain was hammering down, and my ceremonial scissors. This was one of my earlier events. I learned from this experience. The ceremonial scissors weren't cutting the ribbon, so you've got 300 people queuing up outside Matalan. Most of them can't see me because it went immediately around the corner. And they're waiting for me to cut this ribbon. Except I'm hacking and gouging. It's not working, and it's coming down stair rods, and not everyone's got an umbrella. I'm so sorry. I'm doing my best. And then after that, in the end, they walked around. Everyone walked around the ceremonial ribbon with me sort of waving in the rain. And after that, I always had a pair of scissors in the top pocket. That was always a Lord Mayor. An important tool. Another funny story was I was getting dressed, and I lived on this council estate. So the driver would have to come with the robes and get me dressed up, and afterwards I'd have to put the chains were real gold, so occasionally I have to keep them on me, and I put them in a safe afterwards, otherwise I weren't insured. So I'd be carrying £1 million of gold chains around this council estate, which was kind of fun. But he came up and he dressed me, and one of my flatmates said, "Hey, would you mind doing me a favour? Like, my mate's coming to Norwich for the first time. He's never been before, and he's going to turn up here in a few minutes. Would you mind answering the door?" I said, "Yeah, that'd be great." So his mate knocks on the door, and I answer the door, full Lord Mayor regalia, tricorn hat, proper ruffles, the whole bit. I say, "Oh, good evening, sir. Welcome to Norwich." As if this is something that everybody got on their first time to Norwich. So there was some fun stuff like that. In terms of why I did the job and how I got it, well, the Green Party is a younger party. It's young, cool, and trendy. You should join. We didn't have that many older people, and the ones we did were for various reasons didn't want the job, or felt that I'd be more suited to it. It's very much a ceremonial role for those who are thinking, did Tom run Norwich City for a year? Absolutely not. I'm very much a ceremonial, Lord Mayor. Lord Mayor is a ceremonial thing. But I still think it's important because you can peer into the deep dark corners, and you have the ear of anyone who does have some say. So I had meetings with MPs and chats with, the Lord Lieutenants and people who have some say, and you can have an influence on what's going on. So I think it is an important role, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
That's interesting. And I'm just trying to remember, is it Alan Partridge that used to say that he was from Norwich?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It's funny. Yeah, it's just I just was thinking, is that the same place? Yeah.
The pedestrianisation of Norwich City Centre was one of his early things, I think. He campaigned against it, obviously, I think.
Yeah, he was a bit of a character. And then, so you got into property investing full time in 2012.
Mm.
And that was that easy or difficult? Obviously you've stepped out of the role of Lord Mayor, so you've got facial recognition, but did you have money to start investing, or how did you get going?
Sure. I think it's tricky. I think people, people lucky or unlucky enough to be listening, lucky of course, will relate that everyone goes through transitions in life, whether that's death, divorce, debt, the 3 Ds, or finishing being the Lord Mayor and starting your property, or something a bit more wordy, whatever your transition is, right? Or starting any new business. That's a transition. And some can take minutes, some can take, oh, I fancy a Twix. That's not such a big one. But then, hey, I fancy starting a business or a family or whatever it might be for you. Like that, those are big transitions, and they can shock you for 6 months, 6 years in some cases. I was watching an excellent TED talk on how to deal with transitions, because they opened by saying that most people are I think I relate to this, are in transition for roughly a quarter of their adult life of some kind or another. So you shouldn't just go, oh, I'll just wait till I finish this transition and then my life will get back on track. Because if you do that, you're only living 3/4 of your life. Don't get me wrong, because you're in a tough transition, it doesn't mean you should also say, oh no, I'm in a tough transition, but it'll all just carry on exactly the same way. That's not logical or realistic either, in my opinion. You've got to say, hey, you know what, oh, this is a tough time, but let's try and keep the ship going forwards at least half cock sort of thing, so we can make some progress, so that when times get better, we can make even more progress. That kind of idea. But so as usual, I've not answered your question. I'm sure the politician at heart. So to answer your question, I find it really difficult. I think a lot of people do. Show me the person. Show me the person who found it easy to start in property, and I'll show you someone who had a massive bank balance. Because there are a few ways to start in property that don't cost a fortune, but not very many. And I've not met that many people who've managed to do it that successfully. Some definitely are. An ex-mentoring client of ours who does lease options, and he really didn't have to put that much money in property terms to start his business, and he does almost certainly better than I do. But most people, yeah, looking at the current market, or the market when I started, but let's pick the current market to keep it relevant. So around this area, around Manchester, a bargain basement property might be 100 grand, and that might need a little bit of work. So if you've got to put 25% deposit in, guess what? That's 25 grand. There might be some stamp duty depending on your circumstances. There might be a little bit of refurb, certainly some legal fees. It might be double double council tax rather, while you get it rented out. You might be looking at 30, 35 grand, absolute minimum. And a lot of people are looking at 50 grand. So my first question is, have you got 50 grand, or have you at least got 35? And the answer for most people is no, I haven't. So that's your first problem right there. So you either need to beg, borrow, steal. And so that takes us back to when I started out, and I didn't have anything. I came back here and worked a few different jobs, but I was always looking for jobs where I'd have some time to then put into property, because that's what I wanted to do full time. But it's all very well saying, oh, I'm in property full time. Like, how many properties have you got? None. You're not in property full time. You're delusional is what you are. So it's like, but there's that tricky balance of like, what do you do? So what it came down to was, once my parents saw that I was serious about it, and by serious I mean I'd learned stuff, I'd read some books, I actually seemed to know what I was talking about. I was constantly talking to my dad about his experiences. They then decided to lend me the roughly 15,000, I think it was, for my first one, cheaper 10 years ago, to get the first one done. And then from there, I sort of what's now called, I was going to BFF, is that best friend forever? Whatever it is, like buy
refurb, rent, refinance.
There you go. Not BFF, although that as well. So
best friend forever.
Best friend forever. So did the brr thing. I didn't know it at the time. Didn't know it was called, but did that, and that's what got me started. But it was a tough 9 months. It took me nearly a year, I think, from going, yes, I'm doing property to I actually own a property, and that was a tough time, because I had no money, and at 31, I just moved home from being, as you say, Lord Mayor of Norwich, which was a good position, to being a guy who lived in my parents' bedroom and moved home at 31. There's that great quote, which I'm sure you've heard before, about like, when you start something new, and especially if you're going to start something significant and be successful at it, there's nearly always a price, and it's not always a financial price. It's something. It can be any kind of price. And I only worked this out in retrospect, but my price was that I needed to go and live for a few years with my parents' place while I got myself sorted out. Because had I paid rent, that would have really been the end of it, because I was right on the bone for, as a lot of people in property are, as you might relate to. For a few years I was right on the edge of what I had, and I couldn't have afforded a place. Had I done it, I don't think I'd be anywhere close to where I am now.
And did you have any kind of education, or were you figuring it out as you went?
Bit of both. I did have some. For anyone starting out who's listening, keep reading some books. Will Smith, when asked what leads to success, says reading and jogging. Now I realize Will Smith's kind of not everyone's favorite person at the minute to go around slapping people, but I think he's still onto something with that. If you keep reading, however little, but not stories. Nothing wrong with stories in your spare time, but for your professional development, read some non-fiction books. There are about 3 million out there. Any dream will do. Start with Rich Dad Poor Dad, or Richest Man in Babylon, or The Slight Edge. Any of those are good. And then go from there. Those will put you on some other ones. And then so read some stuff, and then there's lots of good, great meetings out there. And I started to get going with those, and very quickly worked out I couldn't afford them. That was one of my problems. Was that meetings then were 20 quid a throw, 30 quid a throw, and again I'm writing my beam ends, borrowing money for petrol stuff. So I realized I didn't have 20 quid, 30 quid a month, 3 or 4 times. That's 100 quid a month, maybe. So that's why I started the cup of coffee meeting. This isn't a plug for the meeting, but the reason I started it was because I thought I need something free and something more often. So that I sort
Yeah.
of made it weekly so that people could meet weekly and I could actually get to bond with these people and know these people and have them as my sort of tribe, if you like, so that I could have someone to either bounce ideas off or to say, hey, anyone got 10 grand? I found a great deal. Or I found a great deal in it and want to give me 10 grand, and that worked quite well for me. I'm not saying, by the way, everyone should start their own property meeting. What I am saying is, whatever your problem is, sort of try and define your problem clearly. So is it, I don't know enough stuff, read a book. I haven't got enough money. Well, then find a ways to get money
What's
or
the
to save
obstacle?
money.
Yeah. What's the obstacle in the way? Yeah.
Exactly right. And for me, it was I need to meet more people there today. So the obvious thing for me was start a networking event. But that if that's not your problem, don't find that solution. But whatever your problem is, obviously try and solve it. Find the obstacle.
And tell us, you mentioned your partner Chris. When did you partner up with Chris in
Sure.
this?
So I've been doing single lets for a few years, and at that time I was buying about one a year because like one a year doesn't sound much, but when you haven't got any money and no income, that was quite good. I was doing quite well to get one a year out of nowhere, as far as I could tell, out of thin air. Anyway, Chris turned up roughly 2015ish and he turned up to a cup of coffee a few times, the networking meeting. So again, power of networking. And then he sort of said, "I've got this deal," and he kept mentioning it a few times. Like, "I've got this deal. Like, would you be interested in coming and look at it? Could you show me some plans?" Da da da. And eventually, he sort of said, "Well, would you want to come down and have a look at it? It's only 10, 15 minutes from the venue of the meeting." And at first, I was like, "What? Why?" It was a bit like I couldn't work out that what I think he wanted and what we know now worked out he did want was sort of help with it or to maybe work on it together because he'd seen, again, once you start to learn some things and bring some energy to a place, he'd seen that energy and thought, yeah, we could work well together. He was way ahead of me. I hadn't worked that out at all. But then he'd had business partners before and I'd not. So he was kind of ahead of me on that one because he knew things I didn't. So eventually we went down to look at this thing and I'm stood outside it and only then did the light go on. He showed me the plans and we're looking at this thing and in my head, his voice goes, he wants to do this with me. And only then did I kind of go, oh, wow. And so what can we learn from that, dear listeners? I'd say it's that like have your mind open for stuff, even stuff you don't know what it is yet. Try not to close too many doors without knowing about it. So be open to like really weird stuff because that was the biggest step change that I've done in my property career. Went from doing single lets to doing multiple unit developments in about 6 months, and there's no way I had money for that. We lent on Chris's savings, Chris's investments to start with. We've since balanced them out, so I've since sort of I'm now 50-50 in the business, but we weren't for the first year or two. But that's because I was only just had my mind open enough to see that there was a big opportunity there, even if I couldn't quite see what it was.
It's funny. I think the quote that comes to mind for me is, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity.
Yeah.
And you just happen to be in the right place at the right
Yes.
time.
Right.
Interesting. And so, I mean, I saw from looking at your company website that you do blocks of apartments now and things like that. I mean, to go from single let to blocks of apartment, what's that? And we talked about transitions earlier. Like there's a bit of a transition there, obviously.
There is, in terms of knowledge and
Scale.
skills and all kinds of things. Yeah, just scale. What I did learn though was, and what I've learned ever since, because I've since been big enough, lucky enough to go into some even larger projects, not my own, but to look at and to examine like what happens when you go from, in our case, sort of 4 and 5 flats in a block up to 50 flats or 100 flats in a block. Went to look at some developments in Wales like that, and what I learned was a lot. There's some stuff on top, often paperwork. So whether that's and I always get my acronyms mixed up as we've seen already, but like CDM, is that right? Whatever. There's lots of paperwork which I don't deal with, as you can probably tell. Chris deals with all the tedious paperwork. Warranties, you need those on new build properties, which you don't need on just simple refurb stuff, which can take ages to sort out and be expensive. Through to like working out traffic plans and traffic management plans and all this kind of stuff again, which isn't stuff you need on smaller jobs. But at its core, it's the same stuff. It's plumbing, painting, decorating. It's we need a wall here. It's crikey, this is falling over. It's that. When you realize it's just that, it becomes a lot less terrifying. But it's still a hurdle. It's still like, oh God, it's still breaking out of your comfort zone and doing something you've never done before. But I'd encourage people to do that as much as they can in a safe way. It's a really tricky one. Like, when does the stretch zone become the oh crikey, it's all gone dark, I don't know what to do zone? And I think that there's no signposts. When you go from one to the other, you just have to work out: is this a fair risk? Is this a risk I'm happy taking? And then I go back to another great TED talk I was watching recently about regrets. And I can't remember all of them. There was four main regrets, and one of them was like regrets around risk. And it's that
Yeah.
the whole thing about how we tend to regret the things we don't do rather than the things we do. So they interviewed thousands of people across cultures, and they found that the people who, for example, tried it, started a business, and then it didn't work out. Most of those people were kind of philosophical. Went, well, we tried it, and we learned a load of stuff, and it didn't set the world on fire, and we ended up closing the business, but maybe we didn't lose that much money, so it was okay. Whereas the people who had an opportunity, a fork in the road,
Never
to
did it.
try something out and never did it, they typically regretted it, and regretted it hard, maybe for a long time, maybe until they died. So you do have to be careful, because there's a lot of like, oh, it's a business. No, it's not. It's a scam. It's a multi-level marketing scheme. You've got to watch yourself. But once you've done your due diligence, done what you can, I would encourage people to take calculated risks. That Rob Morse has that great saying, doesn't he? That if you risk nothing, you risk everything. And I think that's true.
Yeah, it's very true. And one of the things you mentioned there, just in terms of as you're scaling up and stuff, it's
Mm,
kind of like exposure therapy. People who are, say, petrified of spiders, and
mm.
you get them over this by introducing tiny little, and then you gradually, and like the end of it is them with tarantulas crawling over them and stuff. But it's the same thing. It's like your single deal, and then you go and do, a double house or something, and then you move to the bigger and bigger, and you get to the point where you're comfortable at a much, much greater scale because you've done it already.
Small steps. It's exactly right. Small steps, whether it's tarantulas or sorry for those people who are scared of spiders, by the way, but whether it's spiders or houses. So
Or
again,
heights or water or whatever it
exactly.
is. Yeah.
And of course, like, I don't know your journey, but my guess is you didn't start with the kind of commercial properties you're working on now. My guess is, again, that was a gradual journey of, another 100 square meters here, another 100 square meters there, whatever it was, right? And that's true for everyone. So when you get to the guy and girl of 65 who are doing these crazy big developments, or doing whatever it is in their field that looks so incredible, it's not, what was that thing about Michelangelo saying that this wouldn't seem like genius if you realized how much work went into it? And it's exactly that, isn't it?
It's true. And at the end of the day, it's people realize, you have to kind of keep your head around, together as well, because I was just reading there recently, this guy Rene Benko, who runs a huge group, and they've gone into bankruptcy, but
Mm.
they were global. They owned hotels, everything. This guy was a billionaire, and he's just overextended himself, and the group has gone bust.
Wow.
And they owned Selfridges, they owned like all of those huge big chain department stores and so. And it's just amazing. You would think that a guy that successful couldn't possibly put a foot wrong, but it just
Yeah.
shows you that
Yeah.
you lose the run of yourself, and anybody is fallible.
Oh, it's crazy, isn't it? It really is crazy. Like, I, especially for any of my investors watching and listening, like, we do our best, of course, to protect investors' money as well as we try to protect our own. But there's, we're all just a couple of bad mistakes away from bankruptcy, and that's the truth of it. So the trick is to try and avoid those mistakes.
You have to be careful, all right? Because like you don't know my story, Tom, but like I in 2006 and 2007, I went and I took on my biggest deal ever, and I went abroad for it, and just
This sounds
like
like it's going to go fine.
oh my God, what a humbling lesson. Let's just put it that way. But
Mm.
12 million in investor funds and 30 million of senior debt, and like a massive, massive deal.
Right.
And 10 years later, zero, absolutely nothing in return. So very, very painful. And the worst thing is actually spending 10 years working on something that turned to zero. Like the money, obviously, it's terrible, but that was gone literally in the first day, because you've spent the money on the deal, and then you're trying to make it work for 10 years. And it's
Wow.
those 10 years you spend trying to kind of like right the boat. And if you had known it was going to fail in 10 years, like you would have just gotten out on year one, you know what I mean? But it's all that wasted opportunity that you missed in those 10 years.
Do you think you could have, not to switch roles here, but do you think as you said, it's the first I've heard of this, but do you think you could have, if you'd known what you know, would you have got out in year one? Like, it's a tough
Well, the
question.
funny thing is had I known, if I was as experienced then as I am today, I would never have even gotten into the deal, because I would have known that this thing is beyond me, but my ego was driving the boat at the time,
Right.
And
Yeah.
whereas nowadays, it's easy to say that, you know what I mean? But at the time, you got yourself in, I can handle this. I'm, well in control here. And then when you realize that, whoa, this thing is much more complicated and, difficult than I thought, then you're now in there. You can't get a little bit pregnant. You now have, you know, 12 million of investors' funds there, and you have to, and you can't say, sorry, lads, I'm off, didn't work out for you all,
Yeah.
and like a quarter of that came from me personally. So it was a very, very painful experience,
Yeah, cranky. Sounds like it.
Tom, tell us about your coach. I mean, you've got you've obviously you've got an investment business and you're a property investor, but you mentioned that you've got the networking business. You also have your podcast, and then you have a mentoring thing. Like, are these all the one business that they kind of interconnect?
Yeah, I'd like to say it was all, beautifully organized. Like there's diagrams of stuff like planets and moons. I've seen diagrams like that where people are supposed to like attract you into the moons and then they come to the planet and that's where you make your money on this stuff. I'd like to say some of that exists. It doesn't. Maybe it should, maybe I should pay some guy to come up with it. The truth of it is I just started most of it for various reasons of, oh, crikey, we need something. Let's do that. And so, the back office is a Word document with some scrolls in it from me. But all those things do exist. So we're lucky enough to have mentoring business. So we take mentoring clients on. For those who want to check it out and are lazy, so can't be asked checking the show notes, visit bestpropertymentoring.com. I couldn't believe that was available either, but it was. So that's us. And then depending when people are listening to this or watching, we also do free mentoring for those who can't afford it. Our kind of way of giving back. We thought we could get down the food banks and help out there. And by the way, that's great work for those people who do that. But we thought, well, we've got some skills in property. Why don't we try and help people like me from 10 years ago who genuinely don't have the cash for mentoring? And so we offer free group mentoring roughly once every 6 months. And so if Gavin's amenable, we'll put the link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So people can apply for that if they just haven't got the cash for paid mentoring at the moment. And those are really nice sessions. And I don't mean nice like we all sit around drinking mulled wine. I mean we get on with stuff, and often those people blow past us in no time flat, and and that's really beautiful to see because they're really motivated usually. So it's almost easier than sometimes the paid mentoring. But by the way, we have some great paid mentoring clients as well. So we have the mentoring side, we have the cup of coffee side, which I've talked about why that came about and why we do that. We went again sort of a necessity is often the father of invention, and for us, like COVID, and we weren't alone in this, of course. COVID came, and so we went online, and then when COVID sort of calmed down a little bit, we went alternate because we built up quite a nice following of people around the world who couldn't be there in person for the in-person meetings.
Hybrid,
so to do a hybrid online offline, so we do that, and then that's where our podcast comes from. So ours are a little bit different, than we record them live with a live audience mostly. Some people can't do Saturday mornings for whatever reason, then we record them in the week, but for most people, most of our podcast episodes are recorded live on a Saturday morning, and then the alternate weeks are our meetings in Manchester for those who want to come along to that. What was the other thing you mentioned we've got? I've forgotten.
Well, you've got your podcast and
that's it. Yeah. So the podcast and the meeting are very much interconnected, intertwined, and then the mentoring as well. So yeah, those are things, and it's almost like we do those things because we like doing them. I mean, I suppose we do property because we like doing that too. But the mentoring and things is, I mean, am I right thinking you do some coaching and mentoring as well, right? Yeah. So you know as well or better than me that it's it can be really fulfilling. Also, there's that old thing about, I'm from a family of teachers, so while I don't want to be a teacher, I think I've definitely got an itch to scratch there. And
yeah, me too. I can totally relate. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's also that thing about if you can teach it, you know it, because in order to teach it, you need to know it three ways, because somebody might not get it the same way you get it. So you need to be able to, lease options is the classic for me. If you can explain lease options to a room of 50 people, then you've understood lease options, because you need to attack that 10 different ways. Because in my experience, people understand lease options in different ways. It's a simple-ish concept, but by crikey, it can get complicated or convoluted if you don't know it. So we do all those things and thoroughly enjoy them.
And Tom, in terms of like advice and stuff like that, what would be the best? Well, let's keep it to property. Like, what would be the best property advice that you've gotten in the last, say, 10 years of your career?
I'll try and get some property advice. I was reading an article by about William Shatner, who played Captain Kirk and some other parts.
Captain Kirk,
and yeah, thank you. And he must be like in the 90s now. And someone asked him, they said, if you could speak to your 20-year-old self now, what would you advise him? And he said, he sort of thought about it. He said, I wouldn't tell him anything, because if I was going to give him advice, it would be that none of this really matters. Not in a nasty way, but just like, go out there, have some fun. It's all whatever. It's all going to be over soon anyway. So just have a nice time. But he said, what, I wouldn't want to say that to my younger self, because he'd lose the drive, and not go and do anything. So in fact, I just stayed quiet and and hope that he had the same life I had, because I had such a lovely time. So I might not say anything to my younger self. I think my younger self might need more of a kick up the arse than that, especially my sort of younger self in property. So my particular poison, as again we were chatting about earlier, is probably procrastination, and I mean poison in the genuine sense of the word. In that it's my particular nemesis or evil. I've got better at fighting it over the years, but I will die a procrastinator. And so what I've learned is that for anyone else who's listening who's a procrastinator, if you're not, then get back to work. But if you are, then also get back to work. But you can fight it. And you can win. You can get better at fighting it, same as you can get, better at boxing or piano or anything else. And this touches on the thing we talked about earlier. Is I'd say to my younger self that you will regret the things that you don't do, not the things that you do. And again, we've heard that before. That's all over Instagram every day, right? So not that I'm on Instagram, but I imagine it is. So as a result of those things, find out what you're passionate about, do that. And that's the best way that I know to a future version of yourself that you're going to be the happiest with, which is all you can, really want. And then I'd probably go on, if I was speaking to my younger self, to tell them the Grand National winner for the next few years, if I could remember them.
Well, it's funny you say the quote that reminds me of this quote. I actually had it cut out, and it was in my wallet or something like that. And it's Mark Twain. It's 20 years from now, you'll be more disappointed by the things you did not do than the ones you did.
Absolutely right. Well done, Mr. Twain. He's a made-up character, isn't he? Who
No,
wrote
no, Mark Twain is the
a real bloke?
American. Yeah, he made up Huckleberry Finn
And Tom Sawyer. That's what I'm getting
and
mixed
Tom
up.
Sawyer. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. So Mark Twain was the actual guy. Yeah, and perfectly true, in my opinion.
Well, Tom, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you. And in terms of, I mean, we've already gone through. If somebody wanted to reach out and connect with you, Tom Dillon on LinkedIn, I'll put a show note, and then bestpropertymentoring.com.
That's it.
Sounds good. Nice to meet you, Tom.
And you, Gavin, really appreciate your time.
All right, guys, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Tom Dillon today. If you did, please do leave the podcast or the video a like, and leave it a comment there with any questions that you have. It would be great if you could leave a review for the podcast if you get a moment. It just does help us putting out more and more of these podcasts. And if you are watching this on YouTube, what I'm going to point you to now is the fact we've had quite a few UK property investors in the last while. And so I'm going to put a link to our most recent conversation with Adam Lawrence for your next podcast. So talk to you next week.